we do need to reflect on that awful image of those two princes following that coffin back in 1997. And those were two boys, and particularly Harry, who didn't think he could save his mother. He feels responsible because of his mother's death. And then when Meghan came along, and if she does have narcissistic tendencies, then one of those characteristics is to always be a victim. That really in Harry, she found the perfect empath, because she found somebody who wants to save her. And in a way, regardless of what we think of the couple, that might be a very good symbiotic relationship between the pair of them. You know, people who sat in St. George's Chapel and said, I'll give it a year, have been proved wrong, haven't they? They're coming up to a decade married.
Well, I've always said that it's an absolutely perfect folie à deux, and anybody who has studied the subject will know that there's no certainty that they are ever going to separate, because, doubtless they will if she meets a billionaire, hopefully with a title, but definitely with at least a 450-foot boat.
Yes.
But otherwise, they could be together they are in many ways perfectly matched. People seem to think that a perfect match is your virtues. A perfect match is often not your virtues, but your failings. And so I agree with you. I think that I've always said when people say, oh, we give it 5 years, depending on the situation, they might be together forever.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and thank you for being here again. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, because here we don't just repeat headlines, we go far beyond them. We take the time to unpack the conversations behind the headlines, to explore how narratives are formed, and to understand how public perception is shaped in a media landscape that moves faster than ever before. I just watched another video of Camilla, Tominey&Lady, Colin, Campbell, and all I can say is that jealousy is really a bad thing. The claims made by these two that Meghan found in Harry the perfect empath because she found somebody who wants to save her Camilla, Tominey&Lady. Colin Campbell are just bitter about Meghan's life. The claims that Meghan will separate with Prince Harry if she finds someone richer and with titles. These are very bad accusations, and Meghan doesn't deserve such kind of mistreatment. And today's topic is one of those discussions that truly reveals how quickly commentary can grow into something much larger than its original form. Especially when it involves high-profile figures like Meghan Sussex and Prince Harry. Now, before we go deeper, it's important to clearly set the tone. Because what we are examining here is not just a single statement, not just one interview, and not just one viral moment. What we are really looking at is a broader system, a recurring pattern in modern media culture where information, interpretation, repetition, and audience engagement all combine to create narratives that can feel authoritative, even when they are still evolving or incomplete. And that distinction between what is confirmed and what is constructed is where this entire conversation begins. In today's media ecosystem, narratives don't just appear fully formed, they are built step by step. A moment happens, a comment is made, a clip is shared, a headline is written. That headline is then discussed, debated, reframed, and sometimes amplified depending on who engages with it and how they interpret it. And as this process unfolds, something subtle but important begins to happen. The original event becomes less central. The interpretation of that event becomes more prominent. And over time, the narrative surrounding the event can take on a life of its own. This isn't always intentional. In many cases, it's simply a reflection of how modern media operates. Fast-paced, competitive, and driven by attention and engagement. Now, this pattern applies to many public figures. It applies across politics, entertainment, sports, and beyond. But in the case of Meghan, the process is especially visible because of the intensity of public interest and media scrutiny surrounding her. When you see commentary about Meghan, what you are often seeing is not just a reaction to a single moment. You are seeing a response to an already existing narrative. A narrative that has been built over time through repeated coverage, public debate, and ongoing interpretation. Each new piece of commentary adds another layer. And as those layers build up, the story becomes more complex, but also more difficult to trace back to its original source. This is where things begin to matter for audiences. Because the more layers there are between the original source and the version of the story people consume, the harder it becomes to separate fact from interpretation. And in today's digital environment, where content is often consumed quickly through short videos, headlines, or social media posts, that gap can widen very rapidly. So instead of engaging with original material, audiences often engage with summarized or interpreted versions of it. And each step in that process introduces the possibility of emphasis, omission, or reframing. Let's make that more concrete. Imagine a full-length interview is released. In that interview, a public figure speaks in detail, offering nuance, context, and explanation. But when that interview is reported, it is often condensed into a headline. That headline highlights a specific quote. That quote is then shared widely. Commentators react to that quote, sometimes without referencing the full interview. Those reactions are clipped and reshared. And by the time the audience encounters the story, they are often engaging with a reaction to a reaction, rather than the original content itself. This is how narratives evolve, not necessarily through false information, but through selective emphasis and repeated interpretation. Now, let's bring this back to the broader conversation surrounding Meghan. One of the reasons she remains such a central figure in public discourse is not just because of who she is, but because of what she represents in different cultural conversations. To some, she represents independence and reinvention. To others, she represents disruption or institutional tension. To others, she represents the pressures of media scrutiny and the challenges of navigating public life in a digital age. And importantly, these interpretations are not isolated. They coexist, but different commentators emphasize different aspects, and that emphasis shapes the narrative. This brings us to the concept of framing. Framing is one of the most influential forces in media. It determines not just what is discussed, but how it is discussed. If a story is framed around conflict, the focus will naturally be on disagreement and tension. If it is framed around context, the focus will shift toward explanation and nuance. If it is framed around personality, the focus may shift toward individual behavior and interpretation. And while the underlying facts may remain the same, the meaning derived from those facts can change dramatically depending on the frame. This is why two people can look at the same event and come away with completely different conclusions. Now, when audiences encounter multiple frames without recognizing them as frames, it can create confusion. It can feel as though there is disagreement about what actually happened, when in reality the disagreement is about how it is being interpreted. And this is where repetition becomes a powerful force, because repetition reinforces framing. When a particular version of a story is repeated often enough, it becomes familiar. And familiarity can create a sense of credibility. People begin to recognize the narrative, and recognition can feel like confirmation, even when the narrative is based on interpretation rather than verified fact. This phenomenon, sometimes described as the illusion of truth, plays a significant role in shaping public perception. Now, it's important to clarify that not all repeated narratives are inaccurate. Many are based on factual reporting, but repetition alone is not evidence of accuracy, and that distinction is crucial. Now, let's talk about one of the most important distinctions in this entire discussion, the difference between observation and assumption. Observation is grounded in what can be directly verified. It includes things like recorded interviews, official statements, public appearances, and documented actions. Assumption, on the other hand, involves interpreting intent, emotion, or private motivations that are not directly accessible. And in discussions about public figures, this line can become blurred. For example, a commentator might interpret a decision as being motivated by a specific intention. But unless that intention is explicitly confirmed, it remains an interpretation. And when multiple interpretations are presented confidently, they can begin to feel like established facts. This is particularly relevant when discussing figures like Meghan Sussex and Prince Harry, whose lives are both highly visible and deeply private at the same time. There is a natural curiosity about their decisions, their motivations, and their experiences. But that curiosity can sometimes lead to speculation. And when speculation is repeated frequently, it can begin to shape the overall narrative. This is where media literacy becomes essential. Media literacy is not just about identifying misinformation. It is about understanding how information is constructed, how it is framed, and how it changes as it moves through different layers of communication. It involves asking key questions. What is the original source? Is this information complete or partial? Is this observation or interpretation? What context might be missing? How has this narrative been framed? These questions help create distance between the audience and the content, allowing for more thoughtful engagement. Now, let's return to Meghan and Harry as a public pair. Their story is often discussed collectively, and that shapes how narratives form around them. Together, they are part of broader conversations about institutional roles, personal autonomy, media responsibility, and evolving public expectations. Different commentators approach their story from different perspectives. Some focus on institutional dynamics. Others focus on personal choices. Others examine the role of media coverage itself. And again, these perspectives are not necessarily based on different facts. They are based on different interpretations. Now, another important factor to consider is the role of strong opinions in media. Strong opinions tend to attract attention. They are more likely to be shared, discussed, and amplified. But strong presentation does not necessarily equal accuracy, and confidence does not guarantee evidence. So when engaging with commentary, it's important to look beyond delivery and examine substance. What is the argument based on? Is it supported by verifiable information, or is it primarily interpretive? Now, let's talk about the role of the audience, because audiences are not passive in this process. They are active participants. They choose what to engage with, what to share, and what to amplify. And those choices influence which narratives gain traction. If highly emotional or speculative content receives more engagement, it becomes more visible. If nuanced, contextual content receives less engagement, it may become less prominent. So audience behavior directly shapes the media environment, and that means awareness matters. Taking a moment to verify information, to seek out original sources, and to consider multiple perspectives can make a meaningful difference. Now, another layer to consider is time. Narratives are not static. They evolve. What is emphasized today may change tomorrow. New information can shift context. New perspectives can reshape interpretation. And older narratives can be revisited and reframed. This fluidity is a defining characteristic of modern media, and it is one of the reasons why critical thinking is so important. Because without it, it becomes easy to treat temporary narratives as permanent truths. Now, let's also consider platform dynamics. Different platforms encourage different types of content. Short-form platforms prioritize speed and simplicity. Long-form platforms allow for depth and nuance. And the same story can look very different depending on where it is presented. A complex issue may be reduced to a short clip. And while that clip may capture attention, it may not capture the full context. This is not inherently negative. It is simply a limitation of format, but it is something audiences need to be aware of. Now, as we bring all of these elements together, what we see is a layered system. At the base are events and statements. Then comes reporting. Then commentary. Then audience interpretation. Then repetition. And at each layer, the narrative can shift. Sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly. And over time, those shifts accumulate. Not because it is entirely false, but because it has been shaped by multiple layers of interpretation. So as we bring this discussion toward a close, let's return to the central idea. This is not just about Meghan Sussex. It is about how modern media functions. It is about how information becomes interpretation, becomes narrative, and how narrative becomes perception. And in that process, clarity and context are essential. So the key takeaway is this: always separate what is observed from what is assumed. Always distinguish between fact and interpretation. Always consider how framing influences understanding. And always recognize that public narratives are shaped by multiple perspectives. Because behind every headline, every clip, and every conversation, there are real individuals whose lives are far more complex than any single narrative can fully capture. And understanding that complexity allows for more balanced, more thoughtful discussions. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth conversations like this one.